Hey guys, I want to talk to you a little bit about the aftermath of World War I. In particular, we're going to look at Wilson's fight for peace here, and that is the creation of his 14-point plan, which he will take to the negotiating table at the end of World War I when he meets with the other Allied leaders. And his hope is that this 14 points will become the basis of the treaty at the end of the war. And so why does he put so much time and effort into devising this plan, this 14-point plan? And ultimately, why does he also take this to Europe himself and deliver this to the committee? This is the first time that a sitting president will ever be involved in the treaty process at the end of the war. So this is kind of a new thing for the United States. So let's take a look at what he had here, why he did what he did. And the first thing is that Woodrow Wilson looked at the destruction and the horrible conditions that were created, the loss of life at the end of the war, and he said war is a terrible thing, and so therefore this should be the war to end all wars. We need to take our lessons away from this and prevent this from happening again in the future. So he wanted to devise a plan that would bring about future world peace and avoid future wars. And he did this by writing his 14 points. And he figured at the cornerstone of his 14 points, a cornerstone of world peace, would be something that would be known as the League of Nations. And that League of Nations, as you can see from the political cartoon on the left, the idea is that the League of Nations would muzzle the dog of war. And therefore, peace could be achieved. You could negotiate your problems out rather than take them into a war with other nations. So he devises the 14 points. They're broken up into three different sections. The first section deals with some of the problems that led to the war itself. So number one, we know that there were a system of secret alliances that created much of the problems in Europe. One nation declares war, its allies then have to declare war, the allies of the other nations declare war, and you have a world war. So the first point was you should not have any secret treaties amongst nations. Everybody should know who is allied with who and what those parameters are. Number two, he says that there needs to be freedom of the seas for everyone. This was something that was important to the United States. Trade is extraordinarily important to its economy, and as you guys well know, unrestricted submarine warfare used by the Germans was creating significant problems for the United States in trade with European allies. Britain also created a blockade to blockade German ports, and so the United States constantly ran into these problems while they were trying to trade. And so, again, as you see, number three there, free trade amongst nations, that should be recognized. 2 and 3 go together very well. 4, Wilson decided that, what we really need to see is nations have small militaries that are more defensive in nature. So depending on your defensive needs would determine the size of your military, but yet they would still remain relatively small. And he also said in his first 5 points here, the fifth point, nations should take into consideration the people of their colonies. Imperialism was one of the causes of this particular war, and the colonies were seen by most nations, or by the people of the nations that were colonized, to be oppressed by their imperial owner, shall we say. So Wilson says, we really need to consider our colonies, the people of the colonies, and ensure that we're meeting their needs, not only in our perspective, but from their perspective as well. So the next 8 points deal with basically restructuring Europe and creating new nations, changing boundaries, and a really important part of these next 8 points that Wilson has is self-determination for the people. He didn't want to divide up nationalities or divide up racial groups or cultural groups of people in Europe, because if you did that, then part of the big problem is that those nations or those peoples want to be unified. And so he said, take that into consideration. And finally, his 14th point, probably his most important to him, was the creation of the League of Nations. And this would be an international organization, much like the United Nations is today. Matter of fact, the League of Nations is the forerunner for this. And how would you address your differences with a foreign nation? If you were where you would have done it with a war before, you would take these problems to the League of Nations, and they would be addressed diplomatically in order to avoid war. Come up with a solution to a problem before a war broke out. And this really is a kind of a bright idea. 14 points looks good from the perspective of Woodrow Wilson in the United States. Well, I shouldn't say from the United States, but at least from Woodrow Wilson's perspective, because we'll find later that Congress does not agree with Wilson on what the treaty ultimately comes out to look like. They were a little bit upset that Wilson created these 14 points and ran off to Europe himself in order to negotiate the end of the peace, something that is usually left to a congressional delegation. So, points 1 through 13. How are they received by the other allies when they sit down to negotiate? Basically, they're rejected. They are all thrown out. And Wilson is willing to sacrifice these. And he's willing to sacrifice these for one and only one reason. And that is because, as we said before, his most important point was the 14th point, which was the League of Nations. And the European allies, the Big Four, agreed to do this. And now, again, why did they reject his first 13 points? And that's because England, France, and Italy wanted to make Germany pay for the war. They really wanted to see Germany ground into the dust. They saw them as the ones that were most responsible for this war, even though they didn't really start it. And so as you see there, you've got the hand firmly grasping Germany, forcing his mouth open. You've got the British Empire, France, America, Italy, even Japan down there on the bottom, squeezing tightly in order to force these peace terms down the throat of Germany. Germany was not invited to sit at the conference table when these negotiations were done. They were just forced to accept the treaty at the end of the war. And you can see the Big Four there standing on the pill bottle, and it says, you've got to swallow it whether you like it or not. Now notice Woodrow Wilson is standing on the ground kind of off to the side, and that's because he really didn't believe in this idea of making Germany pay for the war. But he would do just about anything in order to get that 14th point, the League of Nations, into this particular treaty, because he really saw that as the key. Maybe he felt that, once the League of Nations was created, nations could then go and solve some of these other problems rather than by going to war. So, with looking back on his first through the 13th points, probably thinks that through the League of Nations they'll solve some of those problems in the future. So what actually does the Treaty of Versailles look like at the end of the war? Well, first off, it does end World War I. It's the official document to end the war. 9 new nations will be established out of the European powers that used to be the Central Powers. We see that Germany is absolutely 100% humiliated in this particular treaty, partly because they weren't asked to be there, secondly because they are asked to basically give up their entire culture, their entire way of life, and to accept absolute and complete responsibility for the war with the war guilt clause. So what happens to Germany? First off, they are no longer allowed to maintain any type of army at all. No navy, no army, and certainly no air force. Alsace-Lorraine will be returned to France. It was a western portion of Germany that France and Germany had often fought over. It was rich in resources and heritage, and so it's returned to France at the end of this war. Remember that because you'll see it pop up at the beginning of World War II again. Germany will be faced to pay $33 billion in war reparations to both France and to Britain, divided, not $33 billion to each. But the problem is Germany has absolutely no way of making any money. They are completely devastated after this war, and so they're going to have to borrow that money. And the United States is going to loan them the money, and then that money will be used to pay Britain and France, and then Britain and France will use that money to pay the debts back to the United States. So it's kind of a circular flow, shall we say, of these war reparations. And it won't be until early 2000s that Germany actually pays off their debt from World War I. So that's a pretty hefty expense to bear the German people with. Again, as I said before, the war guilt clause here forces Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war. And Germany will be stripped of all of its colonial possessions, both in the Pacific and in Africa. Russia was excluded from the negotiations, although they were considered to be an ally and relatively important early in the war. But because they backed out of the war when the Russian Revolution happens, they are excluded from any type of negotiation. So once again, what we're going to see is that this is setting the tables for what will happen in the future in World War II. Russia's going to be a little bit snake-bitten when it comes around to World War II about how the Allies are going to treat them and are they respectful enough. Germany, the rise of Adolf Hitler will come directly out of the humiliation that Germany faces as a result of the Treaty of Versailles ending the war. So Americans' response: Wilson goes back to the United States. He takes the Treaty of Versailles back. He gives it to Congress, and Congress says, "Wow, this is really garbage. We don't like it. Number one, this is not a good idea to punish Germany for the war, or humiliate them as badly as they are humiliated. Secondly, the United States wanted to return to an isolationist policy, as you see in the right-hand political cartoon there. If the United States becomes involved in this League of Nations, many senators believed that this was going to tie the United States to foreign policies, to foreign wars, to being involved in European affairs. And that was something that the United States traditionally, going all the way back to Washington, didn't really want to do. And so the League of Nations becomes the largest sticking point in the treaty. And as a result, Woodrow Wilson, as you see, rushing from Congress there, from the Senate, he's rushing to the door, which is labeled American People. He's got the League of Nations under his arm. He is going to take his case to the public in order to get the American people on his side, to really try to trump up this League of Nations and try to force the Senate to recognize that they must negotiate and must be part of this League of Nations in the future. So he dashes out, goes on this vigorous speaking tour around the country, and while he is in Pueblo, Colorado, giving a speech, in the midst of his speech, he has a stroke. He basically stops speaking. They transport him back to the White House, and very little is heard from Woodrow Wilson after that. And again, he was a relatively sick man after the stroke, and really didn't make too many public appearances. And so Congress basically, or the Senate, gets its way with the treaty. Now, the players here, when we talk about the Senate versus the President, was really Henry Cabot Lodge versus the President of the United States, President Woodrow Wilson. So Henry Cabot Lodge was a Republican. Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. Henry Cabot Lodge not only was a person that was supported the idea of returning to isolationism and staying out of European affairs, but as the ranking Republican member of the Senate, he was also very upset that Woodrow Wilson had tried to undermine the Republicans in the election of 1916 by basically saying that, the election of 1918, by saying that it was the Democrats' civic duty and responsibility to vote Republicans out of office and replace them with Democrats. Also, when Wilson went to Europe to negotiate for the United States for the treaty, he took only Democratic members of Congress with him. And so Senator Henry Cabot Lodge was a bit upset about this. And so this becomes basically a personal battle as well between these two guys. And that's why Wilson takes his League of Nations on the road to try to get public support. And if we say, who is the winner between these two guys, Henry Cabot Lodge and President Wilson? Well, in the short term here, it is really Henry Cabot Lodge because he is responsible for killing the treaty. And the treaty is never signed by the United States. In 1921, they will actually negotiate their own end of the war, or own peace settlement with Germany in order to officially end the war between the United States and Germany. But it looks nothing like the Treaty of Versailles. And so at the time, Henry Cabot Lodge appears to be the winner. But what we're going to see is that in the intermediate period between both World War I and World War II, we're going to see that many of the problems that were created in the Treaty of Versailles are going to become causes of World War II. And ultimately, at the end of World War II, what we're going to see is that they're going to revisit much of Wilson's 14-point plan and use many of the same ideas in order to end World War II. So maybe Woodrow Wilson could be considered to be influential later, and we could probably maybe flop this from to the winner being Woodrow Wilson as far as his legacy in history. But after the war itself, it is Henry Cabot Lodge. So there you go. That is a brief synopsis of Wilson's plan for peace and the Treaty of Versailles, how it actually turned out, and the end of World War II. So thank you very much for listening.